Down 17 points early in the third quarter to the Indianapolis Colts at Heinz Field on this Sunday afternoon. The Steelers found a way to apply the tourniquet and end that 3-game losing streak, and end a 4-game streak of offensive futility. They rally back, 3 touchdowns in the second half. 28-24 is the final. Pittsburgh wins at the go-ahead touchdown. Ben Roethlisberger to Juju Smith-Schuster about 30 yards out midway through the fourth quarter, and the defense plays outstanding to keep the Colts off the board on their final several drives. I'm Matt Gajtka along with Mike Asti live from the scene at Heinz Field. This is Pittsburgh Postgame, and this is your Steelers Postgame, our first victorious postgame in more than a month. Pittsburgh improving on the season. Yes, improving to 12-3 heading into the final weekend of the regular year and clinching the AFC North. That's their 9th AFC North championship in 19 years of existence for the division since 2002 when the division was established. Pretty good odds that if you bet on the Steelers before the season, you're going to come out with a winning bet. But overall, that's their 24th division title since 1970. That's the most in the NFL. Mike, I didn't think we'd be talking in glowing terms about the Steelers about, I don't know, checking my watch an hour and a half ago. It was about as bleak as it gets for a team with 11 wins already in the hopper. But here we are. Like I said, they stopped the bleeding. Who knows what happens next week? But now, just as important as clinching the division, clinching a home playoff game, for whatever that's worth in the year of COVID with no fans in the stands, they get a chance to treat Week 17 however they want to treat it. So, yeah, positives for the offense, getting it going. Big encouragement there. The defense, another valiant effort, especially in the second half against an offense that did pretty well in the first half in the Indy Colts and Phil Rivers. But they have now the opportunity to go into the playoffs with some rest, with some experimentation, whatever they want to do next week at Cleveland. It's totally fine because they're in and they have a home game to start.
Well, the Steelers didn't make it easy on themselves. They didn't make it easy on us covering the team. I had to scrap a whole post-game recap, had to scrap several other stories, but the Steelers found a way, and it really was a tale of two halves for the Pittsburgh Steelers on this snowy Sunday here in Pittsburgh. They finally get home. They get to their home field even with fans not in attendance, and they also finally get their offense moving, but not until the second half. The first half was an offense that puttered around, couldn't get going, certainly really couldn't muster up a drive. They were able to get that touchdown run thanks to James Conner's 1-yarder, but that's after recovering a fumble and setting themselves up with field position. So the defense getting really a hockey assist and more on that touchdown. The defense played well and played like they were entering this game motivated and realizing they had to do a lot to kind of overcompensate for the failures of the offense. Ben started the game with a few incompletions right away to Deontay Johnson for a couple and a Juju, and we all laughed at ourselves in the press box thinking, well, here we go again, same old story, kind of trolling the fans a little bit with those incompletions to start a game yet again, since that's been how the Steelers have opened up games in recent weeks when they were losing during that 3-game losing streak. They do end up snapping that losing streak, which regardless of what happened with the Cleveland Browns, regardless of the Chiefs had already wrapped things up and are going to be the number 1 overall seed, and that pretty much seemed to be the case once the Steelers started losing some games, and even Buffalo having the year that they're having. The Steelers needed to win this game, as you said, not only to be able to treat Week 17 how they would want to treat it, because we all know they haven't had a traditional bye week this year. They dealt with COVID more than really any other team. They're very banged up and still dealing with some injuries, and their quarterback that ended up with a solid day based on playing a little bit better in the second half. In fact, a lot better in the second half, is still 38 years old, is still aging, and certainly has showed signs of decline in recent weeks. So they take care of business. They get the victory. We certainly are going to talk about this, and some could argue the Colts maybe blew this game more than the Steelers won this game. Phillip Rivers and the Colts did have the ball with 2 minutes left. They needed a touchdown, not a field goal. He was not able to get the job done. The defense certainly held. The defense giving the Steelers turnovers and key stops when they needed it. This game certainly is maybe a game ball to that Steelers defense to keep them in it. But Juju, Deontay, Eric Ebron even, major pieces to the Steelers offense that were contributing earlier in the year that have Pro Bowl talent were getting it done once that second half began for the Steelers. So for a team that often is criticized, Matt, for not being the best with second half adjustments. During the losing streak, we were saying this. They seemingly were the same team in the second half. That team was not good enough. That's how those teams that just flat out aren't good were able to blow the Steelers out or secure a victory. And today, it appeared the Steelers made those second half adjustments. I don't know if there was an impassioned speech from Cam Hayward or somebody like that who was very vocal on the sideline saying, hey, we got to get our head out of where. We got to do this regardless of the rest of the league. We don't want to back into a division title. We need to get this win. We need to be hot going in the playoffs. We want more for this year. But it happened. They played better in the second half. They made the adjustments. The Colts then couldn't really move up and down the field. Phillip Rivers started making mistakes and getting into the old Phillip Rivers mistake-ridden habits. And the Steelers win. They win the division, which is big because they missed the playoffs the last 2 years. The Steelers' defense accomplishes something that hasn't happened in 30 years with 50-plus sacks for the unit in 4 straight years. The TJ Watt joins NFL history and becomes the first Steeler to have 14-plus sacks in an individual season in multiple years wearing the black and gold. A lot of history, a lot of good, most of that good in the second half, but the Steelers win. But I'm sure it's still a victory that will leave a lot of Steeler fans concerned. Not necessarily the most impressive win, certainly from the worrisome first half that could easily pop up again. So they win the division. That's all good. I don't think this is a Steelers locker room that's popping champagne right now. I don't know if they're going to be caught wearing the division championship hat and maybe would be criticized if they wear that hat, but they did get a big victory. Players that needed to play well did play better in the second half. So it could be glass half full, it could be glass half empty, it could be glass just dead even, middle of the glass there. Nonetheless, they win the division. And now that game against Cleveland does not have to be heart attack city for Steeler fans because it certainly could have been that way. And regardless of that result, that would have been doomsday having to go in that game guns blazing when you do need to rest some players. I would now not be shocked if a lot of those aging veterans get a week off from practice or minimally practicing throughout the week and maybe don't even play that game unless it matters for seeding. But even so, this is a team that desperately needed a little bit of a lax casual week and needed a big win, and they now have both.
Yeah, I don't want to look forward too much. Clearly, that's a big takeaway from today's game. But for me, Mike, it is about what you alluded to, adjustments, getting better as the game goes along. This is the first time in a while that both sides of the ball looked better as the game went along. We've seen some hot starts from the defense, played pretty well at Buffalo, in fact, kept the Steelers in the game. The offense played pretty decent at Buffalo in the first half, but things fell apart in the second half. This is a reversal of that script in a big way. That first half was an all-time stinker, pretty close to it, in fact.
Yeah.
If you want to put it as low
Some
as
may call
dead
it a
last
fart in a skillet.
on the season.
Yeah.
Mike, without that TJ Watt forced fumble, which the Steelers still needed 4 plays to get in from the 3-yard line, by the way. Right. Without that, there's nothing at all positive about that first half for the Steelers on either side of the ball or special teams. But after the Colts get a field goal on the first drive of the third quarter, the Steelers show some signs. They get a couple of deep completions to Chase Claypool. Yes, they don't score on that drive. Remember, it still actually got worse after the Colts made it, 24-7, because the Steelers couldn't get in on first and goal at the 1 after they had first and goal at the 4. So they had 5 plays from the 4-yard line and in and couldn't get in. That felt like the death knell. That was the moment where I thought they really are going to go into the playoffs on a 5-game losing streak after winning their first 11. This is actually going to happen. Right. And it didn't feel like there was any scenario where they would come out of it on top. But you know what? There were a couple of signs on that drive, despite the lack of points. The defense holds. The offense gets the ball right back near midfield. Right. First play, boom, Ben deep to Deontay Johnson. Johnson, who was open a lot of the game. Ben couldn't find him in the first half, but they started to make that connection in the second half. And I know some receivers made some huge plays outside of Johnson. I mentioned the Juju touchdown catch. Yeah. Ebron was back making some plays underneath. I already talked about Claypool. But for me, Deontay Johnson continues to be a huge story to this season. And that touchdown catch, Mike, I think permanently backed off the Colts safeties, and it gave the Steelers a lot of room to operate. Yeah. Some of those intermediate and short passing plays were suddenly very open, and the entire playbook was open to them. So that's my take on it. It just took 1 or 2 maybe tries downfield where the Steelers looked dangerous, and the Colts actually had to honor it. And wow, it's like magic how things changed from there.
It's also been a thinking by some, even though many were loving to criticize Ben Roethlisberger, and he certainly has been bad in recent weeks, certainly looked like maybe the career was over. Mike Tomlin even deserved some criticism in recent weeks. It's been bad all the way around for the Steelers recently, but some, and I said this, some did think that with all the talent on the Steelers and around the Steelers, and Ben not being helped in his decline in recent weeks. Remember, there was a game he had 20 incompletions. Literally half of them were off drops from the receiver. It was an historically bad drop day for the Steelers just a couple weeks ago. So the talent on this team, still the young talent with Eric Ebron, Juju, Deontay Johnson, and with Juju's contract situation still in flux, and that's kind of more of an offseason show, but still, Deontay Johnson, as you're saying, he does give Steeler fans security that he could be a future number one receiver, that if Juju has to leave for whatever reason, contractually or otherwise, that Deontay could be that guy. He could step right in. And James Washington, not really involved in this one. Eric Ebron able to be that security blanket for Ben. That was big as well. So the Steelers have talent there, even with Ben's decline, that if he can get back to even being a point guard there and just finding who's open and not making the mistakes and being close to what he was earlier in the season. And if the receivers and that talent could help him and they could get back to what they were capable of doing, that would really be able to be the driving force for the Steeler team. And the impact that was there from this Steelers defense from Jump Street, the effort that was there from this defense, I hate to say this, but it was almost irrelevant in the first half because they just couldn't have a break. The offense could do nothing. That I thought they were playing well. I know you favorited that tweet of mine or liked that tweet. I mean, they appeared to be playing well to me, even though some were criticizing them, but it didn't matter because the Colts were still able to march up and down the field, not because Phillip Rivers was dominating and imposing the Steelers defense, because they were just flat out exhausted. They never had more than a minute and a half off the field. And once they got to have a regular break, that pass rush that was there in the first half, it became evident again in the second half. They're able to generate turnovers like they've been, like Minka and the team had talked about in a video we put on PSL, wanting to do all week long. And all of that seemed to matter more once the Steelers offense could complement it with a few long drives themselves and score without having the defense to give them a gift basket and a Christmas present for that touchdown. So once it just all came together, the second half was a completely different team, almost how it seemed. Again, I'm sure on a Colts post-game show, their media are yelling at the fact that they blew this game and it's going to hurt their seeding, and they had the Steelers right where they wanted them and they should have finished the job. And if they would have played halfway decent in the second half, despite the Steelers comeback, they should have won the game. And all of that may be true, but if the Steelers play like they did in this second half, they certainly can beat anybody. If the Steelers play like they did in the first half, they could lose to anybody. We don't yet know which Steeler team we would get in the postseason because we haven't seen them do it now for an entire game. But that Steeler team in the second half made everything the defense was doing all throughout mean something. And Ben is not going to throw 80-yard bombs every other play. If that's what he wants to do, that's what he even tried to do last week. That's just not going to work. They can do this dink and dunk type of offense with every now and then a big play, as long as the receivers catch these passes when open and they get separation. And Deontay in particular was getting open. He was getting separation. Juju, I'm sure, Matt, Juju having what ended up being the game winner. I criticized him a lot this past week as well. I felt the dancing was a bit much while losing, but I'm sure that he loved that. I'm sure the team loved that for him. He ended up with the game-winning touchdown catch for a 25-yarder after facing all the criticism this past week. So now he can dance again and celebrate and be happy. People will probably get off his back for a week. So everything that could have happened positively to take heat off this team did in the second half. Doesn't make me forget the first half, but yeah, a lot to love from that second half. And if they do that again, they're close to being back where they were, because a lot of teams around them are still struggling, as now they again can gear up with that playoff mindset with only 1 week left.
I'd like to gloat a little bit here, Mike, and this is Pittsburgh Postgame, by the way, on Pittsburgh Sports Live. I think I took some heat a few weeks back when I said it doesn't matter what the running game does. I was being a little bit hyperbolic there. I just want to say I was literal. Exaggerating for effect. Right. But you look at the Steelers' numbers today, and I think we can say at the end of the day, 28 points, a comeback win. In the end, a pretty effective day for the offense. And look how dangerous they looked in the second half. And I know that people would say, well, they should have been able to run the clock out, and maybe they'd have a point when it came down to it. But just 20 yards on the ground for the Steelers today. 14 carries, 20 yards. The Colts had 127 for 28, and they lost. So, again, the concern about the run game, look, they're not going to be able to run the ball. It's just, that's how it is. But if they do hit the intermediate and the deep passes, or at least try them once in a while, and look like they're a threat, then that short passing game can be the replacement for the running game that it was in the first half of the season, and that we saw again here today. At least the Steelers got a couple of first downs on that final offensive drive before the kneel down, and those were on short completions underneath, so it can work. It's not perfect, though. I understand they're not the Chiefs. They don't have a couple of really good running options. They don't have a great offensive line like the Chiefs do. But the Steelers do have a passing game that can be dangerous when they're diverse in how deep they go down the field. So that's the kind of diversity they can strive for. I'm not saying it's a world-beating team, but they can certainly put up points in bursts without having a good running attack. That's how it is. So I just want to put that much out there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the case. In today's NFL, it's a pass-first league. You need to be able to pass the ball to win a championship more than you need to be able to run the ball. And if you can complete short passes, it can serve as a run for you. That's how the Patriots were able to increase their dynasty. That's what Tom Brady did for so many years. They never had an elite running back who's going to the Hall of Fame, and they were able to win all those championships and win all those games. So it can be done. It still will give you concern for a deep playoff run just because of the weather conditions, and you would rather be able to close a game with the running game. I would say, in the compromise that I said to you weeks ago, and it still, I feel, exists, that while you don't need to be a blistering team that dominates on the ground, you don't even need 100 yards on the ground. You certainly don't need to be the Titans with Derrick Henry. I would still think you'd rather be a Steelers team in the postseason that is a little bit more versatile, a little bit more balanced offensively, and has the ability to threaten the run a little bit more. I do think they threatened it more today, which kept the Colts defense honest, but you need even more than that. You do need to be able to threaten it. I would say if I had to throw a stat out there, I would feel more comfortable with 50 to 60 yards on the ground than 20 or 13.
As would I.
Or 3. I mean, these are literal numbers that somehow are in my brain. I mean, we're looking at 13 a couple weeks ago. So that's a bit, that's a stretch. I also do want to caution, and I do not want to be that guy on this show, Matt, but nobody's picking the Colts to win the Super Bowl. I love Phillip Rivers. I think he's a Hall of Famer. I think he's underrated. It's the Colts team that is good. They're going to be in the postseason, but this is not a world beater opponent either. If they got down 22 points against the Chiefs, not even just the Chiefs, against the Bills, against, maybe even Miami, we saw the Fitzmagic out there, depending on who their starter would be in the postseason, against even Tennessee with their defense, even though they don't score as many points, it will be a rough day and probably a loss for the Steelers team in the postseason. And that's just the AFC. If they somehow would represent the conference in the Super Bowl, I don't think they would be able to come back from 22 pretty much to any team they would face in Tampa. So that's going to be still an issue that may come to roost here. At the very least, I think there's more confident that they're going to have that home playoff game that could have been in doubt with a loss. Separate from that, they're going to be able to have somewhat of a break, even though they're going to have games to play and not a full bye. They can be a little lax with older players, and it might give more confidence they can win a playoff game or two. But remember, this was an undefeated 11-0 team that we both said championship or bust a few weeks back. It's only a month and a half ago. And based on that first half, based on the second half, they still haven't put it all together. There is still concern that it's still going to be ending with people saying 6 months from now, this was a disappointing year with the way it closed. They still did lose that Bengals game that should have securely been a win that would help their seeding out. You'd hate to see this be a 3-seeded team knowing it's only different by one game when they should have beat the Bengals. So all of that still exists. They didn't dominate a great opponent in the Colts in that second half. They're a good, not a great team. But you don't need to dominate on the ground. You do need to have a little bit more than the Steelers give you on the ground. But I would say the benefit is that if you can't run, and they don't have a featured back, so I don't believe they can run that much more, you need your receivers, especially your tight ends and different slot receivers, to be able to catch the freaking football and then do something with it. That happened in this game. It has not happened recently. So in order to do what you're saying of the short passes, they need this result again from this second half. If that happens, that can be okay, and that can be a successful offense for you with an aging quarterback. If it doesn't, you'd have problems. I would not be shocked to see this more. Again, these are talented players. They got back going. It was more of a weird oddity that they were dropping so many balls they did in recent weeks. So that's a thing. And just for a little aside here, from what I've seen, I believe this to be true, that Mike Tomlin now has credit for his biggest comeback of his coaching career. So the Hall of Famer, his team completes a 22-point comeback. That is the largest comeback, I believe, under Mike Tomlin for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Saw that from our colleague there, Alan Saunders, who claims Jim Nantz mentioned it on the broadcast. Obviously, I wasn't watching the broadcast, but either way, it's one of the best. I would imagine that might be accurate. But still, 22-point comeback for Mike Tomlin. I think Mike Tomlin and Ben might hear a little less criticism this week after this win, so I'm sure they're going to love that. And we've already seen players post the pictures of wearing the hats and jerseys and being happy that if they would have won the division because they backed into it, they would not have probably wanted to put that hat on or post that picture. And if they did, they get criticized. So at least all of that can occur with Ernest. But history here is able to be celebrated and they get the comeback win. So maybe this can be a key point that people write in a Disney film, that the Steelers galvanized together and got back going off of a 22-point historic comeback over the Colts in week 16. Maybe. We will see still.
It actually tied the biggest comeback in the Mike Tomlin era. 17 points was the biggest deficit at 24-7 right after the half. And but it is the biggest second half comeback. It's the first time a Mike Tomlin coached team, and of course, we're only talking about the Steelers here. It's the only team he's coached at the NFL level. But it's the first time a Steelers team under Tomlin has won a game when trailing by 17 in the second half. So
and
at least
22 unanswered
half comebacks.
Yeah,
that's the biggest one that we've seen since the Bill Cowher era. And it would date back to, I'm guessing, that 2002 wildcard game against the Browns at Heinz Field. Right. I forget what the deficit was in that one, but it was maybe 19, maybe somewhere in the 20 range. So not quite as dramatic, not quite as much on the line, but it was still a division winner. And Mike, that could have been the saddest division clinch of all time today. Of course, the Browns lost to the Jets, missing 4 wide receivers, but still lost nonetheless. The Jets have now won 2 in a row. They're not getting Trevor Lawrence, by the way, if you care. But the Browns couldn't take care of their business, so it wouldn't have mattered. But imagine slinking into those shirts and hats. I wonder if they would even have taken them out of the plastic bags if they would have lost.
We were saying in the press box,
11-4.
Imagine being the intern that had to pass those out if they would have won that division off of backing in, because that probably would have been a job. This little intern would have said, "Okay, I still got to do this. It's on my script here." And I don't know, I'm a little nervous as TJ Watt takes it and throws it in the trash can. And also, as you know, Pittsburgh media, Matt, if they would have posted a picture wearing a division championship hat, even after missing the playoffs the last 2 years, which is still an accomplishment, but backing in with 4 straight losses and Cleveland losing to the worst team in football, Twitter would have just went nuts. And it would have been a firestorm this whole week at, how could you be happy about that after losing? So they don't have to deal with that by getting this victory and the comeback win, the 22 unanswered to complete that 17-point comeback. That's great for the Steelers. I mean, that's a positive, obviously. There's still a reason to not have complete jubilation, I would say, certainly from the first half and the team they did it against. But there's a lot of teams out there that aren't playing perfect football. The Chiefs have still struggled despite getting some wins. The Ravens have been puttering along and don't look like a playoff team. Miami, it took Fitz magic to somehow get a great comeback and eliminate the Raiders after their starter, who was Tua, the rookie, not able to get the job done. But who knows with that team. So Tennessee hasn't looked great either. There's still reason for optimism around Steelers Nation that has not been there for several weeks. So this was a much needed victory, to say the very, very least, for the Steelers somehow, with however they get it. And they did get the win.
Speaking of our friend Alan Saunders, he said something or tweeted something before the game, Mike, that I wanted to get your thoughts on. He said that he didn't care if the Steelers won or lost, but if the offense didn't show something like they had fixed their issues, or at least if the offense didn't come close to looking somewhat like it did in the first half of the season, then it really didn't matter what happened in this game. And I agree with that, because I think we know what the defense can do. The defense is not going to be as dangerous as it would have been with Bush and Dupree, and to a lesser degree, Robert Spillane healthy right now. They do get back Vince Williams, which has been a help certainly to a guy like Avery Williamson, who's still trying to learn a lot of the nuances of the Steelers defense. But I digress there. The defense, I think, is what it is. And I don't want to minimize them, because I love what they did today. I think they're as much of a story as the offense was when it came down to winning this game. But in the overall overarching arc, the narrative of this season and trying to project the ultimate ceiling of this team, it does come down to the offense. So for me, my feeling on this team has definitely changed in the last couple of hours. I was feeling like there was nothing that had changed at the half, clearly. And I already talked about the inability to get into the end zone from the 4-yard line early in the third quarter. But after seeing that second half, I feel like Steelers fans can at least have some level of reasonable optimism that this team can give another team a scare in the first round and be a threat to get at least to the divisional round of the playoffs, if not beyond. So for me, I agree with Alan that this was about the offense showing something, and the offense certainly did show something, and it looked meaningful to me. It didn't look like a fluke. It was several drives in a row where they got multiple first downs and moved down into the red zone and scored on most of those. So for me, it's mission accomplished for the Steelers. Win or lose, we knew they weren't going to get a bye. We knew they were probably going to win the division. It wasn't locked up, and now they have. So that's what it's about for me, and that's what I will take first and foremost from this game.
The Steelers won, but yes, the win would not have been nearly as meaningful if somehow they won the game thanks to the defense just clamoring down and creating turnover after turnover and getting in Phillip Rivers' face. And that was what occurred most of this game. They did make it difficult on Phillip Rivers, certainly in the second half. The defense seemingly got better as this game progressed and used that rest in the second half and was able to use different rest. The offense was providing them to continue to get better. And that pass rush and the ability to create turnovers is what the defense does best. The defense goes into every single game, and they tell us this. They want to create a pass rush and generate turnovers. They did both in this game. But if that's the way they won, it would have been unsettling because everyone would know, and as you know, you're not going to win a championship. You're not going to have a deep playoff run unless you're the 2000 Ravens somehow, 85 Bears. If you just rely on the defense to be all world and generate 2 or 3 interceptions, score off turnovers, give your offense a short field every week, all the time. You cannot rely on that to be the bread and butter that leads you to victory. You need something from the offense to at least muster up drives to allow the defense to get some rest every now and then. That happened in the second half. It didn't in the first half. If that keeps happening, yes, even if the offense doesn't play as well as it did in the second half or takes a little bit of a dip, then that can certainly help the defense. That can lead this team to playoff wins. If they would have just won because Mike Hilton, Minka picked up a couple pick sixes, TJ Watt forced another fumble, they scored off of it, or all of a sudden these turnovers put the Steelers on the 20-yard line and they're able to give a 10-yarder to Eric Ebron, another one to Juju, and then Connor to run in, and they still have the same stats and just a couple touchdowns off short field. There would be reason to not feel that great because those results are probably not going to be anything you can rely on again. But the offense playing better in a win, best result. The offense playing this way in a loss would have, for me, weird to say, that might have even have been a better feeling around the team than if they would have won just off defense with the offense being so bad. So I get it. I definitely agree with that. But at the end of the day, the offense turned it around in the second half. They're able to get the victory. Do you feel the confidence that we're going to see this from the offense again, though, in the second half? Because that's the other thing that occurred. So that doomsday scenario did not occur. But that's going to be the question on every single talk show all week long. Can Ben mimic this in the future? Can he do this for a full game? Can they do this against better teams? Can these receivers and this offense play at least close to that second half level throughout an entire game? And if not, will this game be meaningless? That's going to be a major question that I honestly don't think anyone has an answer to until we see it. We've still not seen it through 2 halves of football. Right now, it's still opinion. I believe it can happen. There are reasons for concern, but I'm tempted to lean more that it can happen than not. But there's no way to legitimize that until we see it.
And I agree with that. And obviously the concept, the proof of concept here is only about a half old. So There'll be an opportunity next week, and we'll see who even plays next week as well. I do want to further address the Ben Roethlisberger side of that, but I also want to get to some fan input here on our chat screen, reward some folks a half an hour in. This is Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live, Steelers edition. We have Dave Gormley saying holding the Colts, to a field goal in the second half, that first drive, was big. And I'll admit, when Tony Romo on the broadcast, the CBS broadcast, said, that was huge for the Steelers to hold them to a field goal, I thought, okay, so it's 17 points instead of 21 points. I don't think it's that big of a deal because to to that juncture, the offense had shown nothing, and I figured, what's the big deal there? It's not that
I didn't
that
believe
huge
in the offense then either.
Those two.
Right.
But in the end, it was, because then the Colts needed a touchdown on the final drive instead of just a field goal. So shows you what I know, at least in this case. It's Walt Flanagan says, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Walt. This game was something. It was bad for a fat man's heart. I'm not going to disagree with that. I think it was bad for anyone's heart.
Have some Christmas cookies, man. I know you got some left over.
Riding on. Yeah, I had a little too many cookies a couple days ago. Yeah. Trying to cleanse my system today. But neither here nor there. Walt continues, and this is what I wanted to talk about next with you, Mike, so it's good segue. Thank you, Walt. He says, still confusing how Ben could be so bad in the first half and so good, or at least so much better in the second half. And I did have the half-by-half numbers for Ben Roethlisberger, at least the basics here. First half, 11 for 20, not very good. 98 yards, even worse. 0 touchdowns. Second half, 23 for 29 for 244. And 3 scores. Also, no picks. Just as important, the Steelers did not turn the ball over today. That was a
they
hidden...
could not have afforded one turnover in the way this game
No, they
went.
couldn't have. That was a hidden tough spot for the Steelers last week at the Bengals. 3 turnovers led to 17 Cincy points there right off the hop. So no turnovers. I realize sometimes turnovers are luck, sometimes fumbles are luck, but they didn't even put the ball on the ground. There were no recoveries to be had. So all good stuff there as far as ball security. But for Ben, Mike, I don't think it's really that big of a brain surgery moment here to try to figure it out. Just think the guy got a little bit of confidence going. He felt like his old gunslinger self in the second half. And I'm not sure if he just lost confidence in his arm, lost confidence in what he was seeing out there. It certainly looked like that last week when he was throwing to linebackers, hitting them right in the chest with passes. But and there were some of those shaky moments in the first half. But I think the positive within the positive that is this offense coming to life is that Ben's arm still has some life in it. It's not great. I commented on Twitter in the second half. He's still not fitting those balls into those tight windows like he used to. But as we saw with Phil Rivers in the first half, you don't need a huge arm to succeed in the NFL. You just have to make the right decisions. And Ben started doing that. He was even throwing in some pump fakes, which we've seen from him in the past when he's really starting to feel it. And feel confident. In fact, the pump fake set up the Juju touchdown, now that I think about it and look back on that play. So for me, it's more about the mental than the physical side. I don't even think Ben was falling apart necessarily. Yes, he's less mobile. Yes, there's less velocity on these passes, but the guy can still get it done. And so I'm glad for his sake and for the Steelers' sake that he figured out that there's still plenty of ways for him to slice and dice a defense without necessarily just bulleting one right between a couple of safeties.
Nail on the head about the mental over the physical. Obviously, Ben's physical is not what it was, but that would be the case for any of us at Ben's age. And we also have to remember that Ben's physical, if a doctor was going to examine him, would probably say he's a bit older than his age even says, with the motorcycle accident, everything he's dealt with, the stress of his entire career and life and that progression. So that makes sense. But you can still win with an aging quarterback. We've seen the Saints do it. We're seeing Phillip Rivers resurrect his career. People thought he was done after a miserable season last year with the Chargers. He's been much better this year for a playoff team in the Colts. We've seen Brady do it. He was able to get better as this season's progressed. Tom Brady at 42 years old, Matt, believe this. He is literally getting better as the season goes on. Mm-hmm. Nobody would have thought that earlier in the year. Why is he getting better? It's not because he's throwing 70-yard bombs and he's trying to say, Antonio Brown, you're so talented, you need to burn the field and we'll play a video game. He's sitting these receivers down clearly. Him and Bruce Arians are saying, look, I am older. I don't have the arm strength I used to have. I never was a guy with a great arm strength. And we're going to have to move the offense this way. You'll get yours, but you're going to need to help me out a little bit. And we're going to do the offense this way in order to win. Same thing the Steelers are doing. So it doesn't seem to me that they're calling different plays and they're using him different than they were earlier in the year. They knew they weren't going to be able to have him use his cannon for an arm of years past throughout this season, even earlier in this year. But he was just flat out making stupid mistakes in these past few weeks. And I think even frustrated to the point, Matt, I'm not a sports psychologist. I can't claim to know what Ben was thinking, so I'm going to add that caveat in. But if you watch the game against the Bengals in particular, at the end of that first half, once he threw that touchdown that kept the Steelers in it and kept it interesting and kept us thinking, okay, maybe they're going to come back and win it, he threw his hands in the air and he gave a celebration like he just won a Super Bowl, like we hadn't seen him get that excited in years. And while everyone was saying, okay, Ben's back, he's happy, I was thinking, this looks like a frustrated Ben that doesn't know what to do and is just, man, God, like wanting to scream that finally something went his way in the game. That was reason for concern, and he never was able to get back going after that moment in that game. That was his only highlight of the whole game. That's why people thought he was done, and some people even wanted Mason through the first half again of this game. But the fact that he was able to not make those mistakes, even when not being as dynamic and not turn the football over, and then eventually see the yards happen with the receivers turning things around and the offense moving in the second half, that's positive. Ben has to be smart with the football in order to win as an aging quarterback for a great team when you're playing this way. He was not doing that in recent weeks, but he played smarter today, first and second half. That's one thing that happened all the way through. He was at least smart with the football, that in the first half they weren't moving the ball, but he wasn't throwing careless interceptions to the numbers of the defense like he was in weeks earlier.
Steelers 28, Colts 24. If you turn it off at halftime, boy, are you surprised. If you woke up with your head sewn to the carpet, you wouldn't be more surprised than you would be if you saw that score after all that. But hey, to borrow a phrase from a certain sportscaster, that's why they play the games, and that's why they play the second halves of games, most notably. That's the first feel-good moment for the Steelers in a long time. Forget even a win, Mike, because they squeaked by a depleted Baltimore team, that delayed game. There's been a lot that's gone on since we felt, I think, that type of unabashed positivity from the black and gold here. It's been probably a couple of months because we started to see some cracks in the way the team was playing as they got to about 10-0 or so, right around that point. So, yeah, I'm sure
maybe
for the players it's relief, right? They probably feel like a weight's been lifted here. And it would have been good next week, too. I think, heck, if they were playing for the division next week and they won that would have been a huge boost as well. But I'm pretty sure just physically, mentally, emotionally, they're all going to appreciate not a week off, but as you brought up at the top of the show, it's going to feel like kind of a week off where you're not going to show too much here against the Browns, that's for sure. Seeding does matter, and they can still rise as high as the 2, I think, still currently. They can get past the Bills. I guess we'll see what Buffalo does tonight.
And they lose the tiebreaker, obviously. So that
they would lose the tiebreaker, so they'd have to be clearly ahead of the Bills.
Right.
So I still think there's still a possibility to rise a little bit higher in the AFC, but they're not going to get the bye because of the rules change this year with 7 teams in each league or each conference as opposed to 6. But I think that it is something. I think it is a tangible difference here. I'm sure the players will feel it. They'll be able to sleep a little bit better this week and have more of a 2-week run-up to the playoffs as opposed to the 1-week turnaround. And heaven forbid they would have lost their last 2 and gone on the road to start the playoffs. So this result changes a lot of things for the Steelers. So before we look ahead and talk about next week, I just want us to certainly appreciate that. And I don't know, Mike, if I'm going to say they still have championship potential. I've seen too many cracks over the past 5 or 6 weeks to really say that. And I don't know if I'm going to see anything next week that's going to be definitive one way or the other. But I still feel now that they can win a game. I wasn't feeling like that was even a possibility in the postseason coming into this game.
That's true. There's still reason to believe this team can win a playoff game. And really, there was not going into this game. Many thought that we were laughing about it on post-game shows earlier in the season, Matt. Even the ones who weren't there, I was laughing about it with the guests that, they're struggling and they're getting wins and we know they're going to lose, but they couldn't possibly lose 5 in a row to end the year. They're going to bound to win one of those games. So they'll at least be able to make it to this point in the postseason because of these teams they're facing, etc. Well, if they would have lost this, just imagine the mental unraveling. Imagine how bad it would have been. Even if they would have won the division, it wouldn't have shocked anybody. If I don't care who was starting, they would have lost to Cleveland in week 17 because it might actually have been mentally. They just said, well, this is over. We're not going to do it. This year's in the crapper. Ben's going to be talking about retirement. That would have been a whole conversation. So that would have really the second half of this game could have saved the season to at least be something for fans to be happy about and to really drive them in that direction. And wow, they don't have the potential, maybe, but it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility. I mean, I would not be shocked if this team reached the championship game. We said championship or bust in weeks and weeks when they were undefeated. I'm certainly not going to say I'm going to predict that to be the case. I do think it's secure. They should at least win. They're going to be favored to win a playoff game. Matt, I think here's the way to best summarize this before we move on to preview. I was talking with a colleague in the press box, and we were joking while they were playing so bad in the first half that, number one, we were doing some research. Has there ever been a team to go into a home playoff game as a double-digit underdog on a Vegas line? Because based on what was going on with Cleveland and other teams, you mentioned that they now secured at least a home playoff game. Well, that's great for them. That's very, very likely to be the scenario. But it's possible they still could have had a home playoff game even with losing because of what else is going around. So if they would have went into a home playoff game double-digit under, and if they would have lost, that very easily could have been the possibility. I mean, that would have just been embarrassing in general to lose all these games in a row after the hot start. It would have been embarrassing in general. You mentioned that Baltimore game. They hadn't played well, even going back to the Dallas game. They played so bad. They played poorly against Denver earlier in the season, even against the Giants to open up the year against Philadelphia. They've had kinks in their armor that I noticed earlier in the year when they were still winning. But I think we also learned you need luck to win championships, but you can't rely on luck like exclusively throughout a season. You're going to have to be good enough. They weren't as great as their record showed earlier in the year. I think we're getting back to, earth of this team, man. I think this is an older quarterback who still has something left, maybe not nearly what he was before, but I think we're fairly learning that he's not an MVP of the league like some were talking about earlier in the year. I think we're fairly learning that while this defense is great and having a great run yet again, that they're very injury riddled, and any defense, when you have that many injuries, is banged up and going to not be as good as it once was. And while these weapons on offense are great, a lot of them are young and inexperienced. That certainly could be a problem. So I think we're learning, as many thought prior to the season before the 11-0 start, that this is basically an 11-5, 12-4, maybe 13-3 at the best type of team. And that, 13-3 could be the record. That would, that's the type of team this is, in that neighborhood. And that team usually ends up with either a division series loss or a championship game loss if they happen to get that far, maybe more on an off year every 5 or so years. So that's kind of where this team is. That's kind of the team this year, that if they get lucky in the right matchup, they could go ahead and make a Super Bowl run. Likely they could go the AFC title game as the ceiling. If they would get there, they're probably going to lose to the Chiefs or maybe even Buffalo. If they happen to play the right team, they could win a playoff game and then maybe get into a second playoff win. If they play the wrong team and the matchup's bad, they could go ahead and lose that game. It wouldn't shock anyone. That's just who this team is. They're more of a great, not elite team, but certainly a playoff team. They're not nearly the 11-0 team that people thought maybe was the best in football and were arguing they should be number one in power rankings earlier in the year. That was never the team. They were getting lucky at that point. They're coming back down to earth, but it's not to say they're really, really bad and the sky is falling and they're not even a playoff team, or people should, everyone should be fired and everything's embarrassing and everyone sucks, like fans were saying the last few weeks. That's not true either. This is a good team that is a legit playoff team that's now being evident as that and should win a playoff game, maybe two. People booking their hotel reservations and flights for Tampa in early February that Alan and I were talking about earlier in the season, that maybe is something that shouldn't occur. And I'm not going to do that research just yet for those flights, but they should still maybe win a playoff game. I think if they don't win a playoff game and they play like they did in the second half, that would still be a disappointment with how the season has progressed.
Yeah, here Allegiant has good flights down to the St. Pete airport. Not speaking from personal experience. Okay. You have to pay for your own water on those, which always took me off. But hey,
I do love it down there. I do love it down. I've been there before.
Pretty cheap rates. Yeah. Hey, defensive superlatives, Mike, as can be seen on SteelersNow.com, where both Mike and Alan Saunders are filling the front page with content from the Steelers' win over the Colts. TJ Watt, first of all, becomes the first Steeler ever with multiple 14-sack seasons. Hey, that says a lot. I know that teams put the ball in the air more. There's more opportunities for sacks than ever before in the NFL, but still a huge feather in number 90's cap. And also the Steelers' defense in general sacked Phillip Rivers 5 times today. That made them the first team in 30 years with 4 straight 50-sack seasons. So we've talked about the Steelers with their impressive streak. What is it now? 70 straight games with at least 1 sack, challenging the early 2000s Buccaneers. Now they're the first in 30 years, the first of this passing era, the first of this millennium in the NFL to ever have 4 straight 50-sack seasons. So, Mike, there are areas to criticize for sure on the defensive side, but I'm still really impressed by how this team is doing it. TJ Watt, too. He doesn't have Bud Dupree on the other side to occupy offensive lines. Yeah. I know this Colts offensive line was missing a couple of starting tackles, but still, it's been a staunch unit all year long. And like I tweeted during the game, I was just really impressed by how many times they got in Phillip Rivers' face, especially as the game went along. We've seen the defense fade a bit, understandably so, in recent games with the offense just going 3 and out over and over and over again.
Yeah.
But just like the offense picked it up in the second half, we saw the defense do the same. And Rivers made some plays down the stretch, and he made things interesting. But it was never really realistic for me in that second half that he was going to find some huge play just because he didn't have the time. And there were black shirts in his face all day long. So another triumph for the defense for me. And I think we all knew coming into the year that the D was probably going to lead the way here with Ben coming back from the elbow surgery, with a young wide receiver core. And it's kind of amazing how 15 games later, that's still pretty much how I feel about this team overall.
Well, TJ Watt is clearly a stud. I mean, TJ Watt, I think it needs to be said. TJ Watt is definitely a candidate for Defensive Player of the Year this year. His brother won 3 of them. It feels like even if he doesn't win it this year, he's going to win one at some point individually. I think this is impressive too. Even while the team was losing, even when the defense has been struggling, and there still are parts of this defense that's struggling. It certainly is tougher on him without Dupree there on the other side. That was big. Many thought that TJ Watt would fall off and he wouldn't be able to be a Defensive Player of the Year candidate without Bud Dupree over there. No, Watt's still getting 2 sacks a game. He's still getting pressure. He's still leading the defense. The defense is still the best unit on this team throughout games. They're still able to get it done against quality competition, and that was evident today. And they played well all throughout, and they did get better as the game progressed, which is not what you would think for a veteran unit that's dealing with so many injuries. So credit to all of that right now. For me, a lot of that goes to TJ Watt. He's become a leader of this team. He's not the most, poetic. He's not the loudest in terms of speaking with the media. His quotes are sometimes hard to find when I'm cutting these clips, but he has become a leader on the field. And bear in mind too, Matt, you mentioned the first Steeler with multiple 14+ sack seasons, which I get. Again, we talked about this too when they set the sack record for the defensive unit, that there are so many more pass attempts today that Tampa Bay unit in the late 90s and early 2000s could certainly say that their 69 was more impressive than the Steelers' 71 during 2016 and 2020. Sure, but you still have to get the sacks, and the illustrious history of Lambert, Mean Joe Green, even going now to Cam Hayward, Kevin Green, the late Kevin Green, who passed away just a week ago, the Hall of Famer. He was literally a sack machine. He didn't do it, and he would have done it if he was with the Steelers for his whole career. He only was there a few years. But the point of it is there have been so many great defensive players, even more modern, like Joey Porter, etc., that didn't do that. He's the first, and he's a young player still. And in terms of how many sacks he has in his first 32 games, that's right up there historic in NFL history. The only thing, Matt, and you know how the sports world works and how fans are going to work, though, the only way to bring this as a negative, and it's great for all these achievements to be celebrated by the defense, win or lose, and they're all impressive because they're all better than anyone else doing it in this same era. Every time there's a comparison, whether it be the late 90s Buccaneers and early 2000s Buccaneers, who went to several championship games and won a Super Bowl, leading the way as a great defense. We know what the 85 Bears did, the 2000 Ravens did. We know what the Steelers defense even did in 2008 when they won a championship. We know the late 80s Giants under Bill Parcells, they're building up to what they became in the early 90s or the late 80s. And that run, championship games, they were the team that gave the 85 Bears the toughest go. They won a Super Bowl even during that span before getting another one with Parcells. Those units that usually are the best defensive units in league history, because as we know, defense can lead you to championships, even if it's not the only thing that gets you there, because you do need offense these days. The Steelers team missed the playoffs 2 years in a row. 3 years ago, they lose a wildcard game at home to a double-digit underdog and get kind of embarrassed with Jacksonville winning that game. And this year, they're in the playoffs, but they get this win. But before this, they weren't feeling hot. It was a question mark whether they would get a playoff one. They still need to go deep in the postseason. This team needs to have more success for this team, for this defensive unit to get its full credit. So I do hope that history 20 years from now doesn't reflect they were a great defense, but the team just couldn't get it done. So we're going to say these other defenses are better in overall ranking, because that's the pressure that's on this defense right now, especially with an older team, with an offense that was floundering. So that's another reason that the offense playing well in the second half, giving them signs of success and showing them that the offense can get it done as well, that has to be something that is a sigh of relief for Cam Hayward, TJ Watt, Joe Hayden, Mike Hilton, Minkah Fitzpatrick, these defensive players, Stephon Tuitt, who got a sack to set Steelers history as well today, Vince Williams, who's now back. Those players had to be saying to themselves secretly before this game, all those other defenses won titles that are great throughout history, but they also had offenses that usually could do a little bit more. And if they couldn't, they were just bewildering themselves. And when they didn't, they were struggling. We need more from the offense to join that history and get a deep playoff run in this streak. So maybe now they can feel like they finally can get that from the offense based on this second half. I'm sure prior to the second half, they probably were thinking, well, yeah, history again, history for you, history for me. It's an Oprah meme. History for you, history for me. Everyone gets Steelers history and NFL history on the defense. But what does it mean if we can't win because the offense cannot score? Today's NFL, you're not going to be able to do what the 2000 Ravens did or the 85 Bears did, where a defense can carry you by yourself without scoring touchdowns. You got to score against Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, those QBs. And the second half Steelers showed they can score. The first half Steelers didn't. We will see moving forward. But yeah, there's finally signs of optimism around Steelers Nation that I don't think have been there for honestly, literally at least 2 months, win or lose. So that's a major deal right now.
Mike, I like to call the winter solstice moral victory day because the days get brighter each day past December 22nd this year. Maybe the Steelers have reached their moral victory day, and it's only going to get brighter from here. We'll tie it in with that. Why not? Steelers win it by 4. They scored 22 unanswered in the second half. That's right. 3 touchdowns in the second half. Now, a bonanza in about 10 minutes of game time. I scarcely believe my eyes. I'm sure I wasn't alone in that. And like I said at the top of the program, again, another division title for the Steelers, 24 in all since the 1970 NFL-AFL merger. Since the league split into 8 4-team divisions back in 2002, the Steelers have won the AFC North 9 times. That's in 19 total seasons. So just shy of 50% conversion rate for the Steelers after missing the playoffs the last 2 years. They win the AFC North for the first time and get to the playoffs for the first time since 2017. That's all the past, though, Mike. Let's talk about the future. Now I feel comfortable looking ahead. Next Sunday, 1 p.m. at Cleveland, First Energy Stadium. Not a lot on the line for the Steelers beyond seeding. The Browns will have plenty to play for, though. So it's not going to be a total dead fish type of game in that way because the Browns now lose to the Jets and their playoff berth is up in the air. So they'll be motivated. How motivated and how fully accommodated, I suppose is the right word, will the Steelers be? For me, Mike, will they, won't they? I'm not sure, obviously, but would they and should they? I think I would play Ben Roethlisberger and the first-team offense for at least another half. We're talking about a unit that didn't do anything good for several weeks, and it was a nice second half, but I want to see one more half. I don't want them to go 2 full weeks time between meaningful snaps here just after it feels like they made a breakthrough. So for me, I'd play Big Ben. I'd play everybody in the first half against the Browns, and then you can rest the guys in the second half. I try to have my cake and eat it too in that way. What say you?
Well, number one, if you can advance seeding, you should definitely try to do that. And that's still going to be a question mark based on how the rest of this week closes out. But I would at minimum play the offense in the first half. I don't think there's any possible argument, Matt, for resting this offense entirely. The way Ben had struggled in recent weeks, the way these receivers had been struggling in recent weeks, the fact that there really still is no running game, which again, it's not the driving force for a title team, but you do need somewhat more of a running game than they provide. At least it would help you. It'd be a benefit to you. And this team could certainly use that benefit to get it done throughout an entire game. None of that has earned me if I'm a coach of this team. And I certainly know how Mike Tomlin thinks at this point, covering him for so long, that they're going to get any time off. I mean, Matt, I would put it to you this way. I think this is reading the tea leaves to show how important this game was and what he wanted to see in this game, especially from the offense. You may have took a little gander over PSL while you're enjoying your holiday festivities. I didn't even think they were going to do this because I was with my family, and all of a sudden we get a notification. Alan and I are texting on how we're going to get this up. They practice full steam with many of these stars on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. Tomlin flat out, Ben wasn't out there, but they basically were saying, look, I mean, Yeah, holiday with the family is wonderful, but winning a championship is better. And you guys have certainly lost. It appeared they basically lost the right to have their holiday with their family on how they played the last few weeks. So many key contributors were out there practicing, and what we get as clips, that's a little tidbit of 3.5 hours of practice. So they were out there, and I would imagine that yes, they played well and won this game in the second half. They still struggled in the first half. I'm sure Tomlin's going to want to see more. We need to see more continuity. We need to see them do it longer. I wouldn't mind having them play all through a game. And certainly maybe you rest Ben a little bit if for sure everything is secure and you can't move position because he is older. But I would like to see more from Deontay, from Juju, from Ebron. These guys are talented. I know they can do it, but they didn't do it for several weeks. So even though that seemed like an aberration to their careers, they still didn't do it for several weeks. They need to be hot to win a title. They've been saying it, that the hottest team usually wins, not always the team with the best body of work through a full year. So I don't think they're going to in any way sit through an entire game. I don't care even if they can't move seating. I definitely think they'll play at least a half, if not more. Some of those players may play more. And I wouldn't mind it because they do need to be hot at the right time to win in the postseason. And I get they haven't had a bye and the resting and the injuries, but I'll tell you what I maybe would do, Matt. If I'm going to rest anybody, if I'm going to go to your mentality of, well, if it's locked up or you can't move seating, rest, I would consider that more on the defensive side of the football. I would consider that more to TJ Watt, unless he wants individual sack totals, because that might be a thing for him. If he wants to kind of increase that mark and set a single season record for the Steelers, which could happen, then okay, let him do it. But maybe then not even so much. But Cam Hayward, with his age, if they cannot move seating, I don't think he plays the second half. Joe Hayden, who's dealt with injuries, Steven Nelson, if he can get out there, Vince Williams, who we're learning day of game whether this man can play for what feels like a month and a half now. He dealt with COVID. I certainly wouldn't mess with it. Anyone who really is over 26 and has missed any time in the last 2 years on the defensive side of the football, I would maybe consider it. And you also have to remember, and this might be a negative way to kind of wrap things up, that the Browns have dealt with so much with COVID the last couple of weeks, Matt. They lost all their receivers except for one this past week because of COVID. The Steelers have experienced this fish before with a team losing players because of COVID, that trickling down. We know it's a 10-day rest at the minimum. We have to have negative tests. I mean, that game is a 1 p.m. kickoff. That game could certainly be moved if COVID continues to ramps up with the Browns. So that's something to keep an eye on if that game stays that time as a 1 p.m. kickoff. Obviously, you don't want to move it beyond that because of the playoffs starting, but that's a concern that I will put it to you this way. The Steelers, yes, it's great that they can rest a little bit and be a little more lax because they have the division title and because they don't have to back in and because they now are playing a little bit better, and that's a positive, even though they need to keep that up and be hot going in the playoffs. Facing a team dealing with so much COVID issues is concerning for a team that has not had a legitimate bye because of opposing teams dealing with COVID-19. So a doomsday scenario would be that game has to be moved time-wise because the Browns have another positive test or something happens with contact tracing or something keeps occurring. I'm sure they just don't want to mess with that going into the playoffs. They dealt with it enough. So that is something to keep an eye on. The fact that the Browns have struggled dealing with COVID now the last couple of weeks, and they have a game against them coming up to end their year. I don't want to jinx anything, but I'd imagine the NFL would have to keep the same protocols the final week, even though you're going into the playoffs, and they couldn't say, we're just going to play anyway, despite positive tests, even though, because we have the playoffs the next week. You don't want a scenario where you're pushing it to Tuesday and you're playing a playoff game the corresponding Saturday or Sunday after you haven't had a bye and all these injuries. So just keep an eye on that is all. And that's not a plus for the Steelers and their future opponent, especially also with everything the Browns have to play for. They have even more to play for than they would have potentially because of their loss to the Jets.
Mike, don't you know, once we turn the calendar page over to 2021, we're all going to be in the clear here. So we just got to get 2020 behind us.
Yeah, well,
heard that.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that before. So we'll see if that actually comes true. We're just waiting for that page to turn, and 2021 can't be any worse for the Steelers or for anybody else on dealing with the pandemic, you'd imagine. So we will see, but we will have our first test of that only a few days in. It will involve the Pittsburgh Steelers, and then that will be a nice preview for how the NHL and NBA and other leagues can handle it. So maybe good luck to them.
as the NHL waiting until the calendar changes to start things full in earnest. But the Steelers, yeah, that's just something that almost makes you laugh and wince that, the Browns lost all these players because of COVID, and that's the final game of the season, and it's 10 days, and that's going to trickle down to the next week. And if their facilities shut down, then when can they play? And yeah, I mean, it's 2021, though, when the game will be played. So maybe everything will be fine. That's true.
It'll be magic once we get to January the 1st, which is Friday.
Right.
Just got to get to Friday. That's all it is, people. Just, bunker down. No one do anything. No one change anything.
Right.
Just, stay locked down. We'll get to 2021.
Warp speed ahead to Friday.
There's one last comment I wanted to address here. Commits on drugs, which may be an appropriate moniker here.
It might have been one not to read.
Says the Colts didn't play the Steelers. We played the refs. What were those calls anyway? Good game. NFL is scripted and rigged. I think it's really hard to get any kind of sympathy from Steelers fans on flags or lack of flags, considering TJ Watt has played the entire season in a perpetual arm bar, just being passed along from one offensive tackle to the next one from week to week.
Right.
We saw it again this week. They're just not going to call holding in these situations. It's just that's how it's going to go.
Did you think there was a pass interference in the end zone, though, late in the game? Because I will say that I'm not going to go to the refs either. There were a few plays that if they would have been called, as much as maybe Steelers fans would have been upset, probably the story would have been by media, same old story the last few years. Like this, the referees could have easily called it the other way, and we probably would have been saying, well, you can't be mad. That's just how they've been calling it for 2 or 3 years now. So there was a couple, what I thought might have been a PI into the end zone on a missed throw. Overall, though, I don't think the referees had anything to do with the decision of this game. You have to remember, Colts fan there, whatever you want to call yourself on our channel, the Colts had a 17-point lead in this game. They allowed 22 unanswered points. They have a future Hall of Fame quarterback as well. Yes, there may be an aging team too, but they're a playoff team. If you're a playoff team, you should hold a 17-point lead. I am sure in their locker room right now it's being said, if we are a playoff team, we need to hold that lead against anyone, regardless of refs. They didn't do it, and they had the football with 2 minutes left, and they didn't get far enough down the field. Yes, they were trailing by 4, Matt, but it's not like they were all the way to the 20-yard line and then got derailed. They would not have even had an easy field goal if that was where they had to go. They got to about to the 35. It still would have been a far kick. So they blew the game just the same as the Steelers won it. They faced a different Steelers team in the second half. They did not make their adjustments. There were a few calls that I thought could have went the other way, but the referees certainly are not the story here by any means for me.
Comments on drugs did say that y'all played well in the second half, so
right, okay.
He or she has some grip on reality there. I think the Steelers got one legitimate break. The pass interference before the Juju touchdown, I thought that one was highly questionable. There were a couple other ones where feet got tangled up. We haven't seen the Steelers get a lot of defensive pass interferences against or called in their favor in the last couple of weeks. For me, that goes to show how much the referees also look at, well, how close is the pass to where it should be? How much of a rhythm is the offense in? Because I think they're just as human as us. They're watching the game. They realize if Ben's trying to force it into a group of 4 defensive backs, they're probably not going to give you that pass interference call. But if it's one-on-one, it's a good decision. I think they're more likely to do it. I think that's how the human element creeps in.
They're well aware that they know that a veteran quarterback, especially in a game between 2 veteran quarterbacks that have combined for about 40 years of football, they know that if the quarterback is struggling and he sees double coverage, he may very easily throw it there, hoping it's not picked off and hoping he gets a flag because of the activity over there. They know that's a game plan strategy for many veteran quarterbacks. Brett Favre made a living doing it and went into the Hall of Fame doing it. If he didn't get a touchdown pass, he would try to feed it over there, get the flag, or end up throwing the pick. So the refs are not going to let that strategy continue in all perpetuity throughout history. They're smart as well. This is a veteran crew that's been around the block too. So I'm glad they didn't just let that strategy be good enough for these quarterbacks who clearly were trying it at times, but also kudos to them to try it, because there was a while there where anything Ben could try would have been better than what he was putting up. But they knew the referees knew what was going on there. You throw into quadruple coverage, you're probably looking for a flag. Certainly when it's the end of a half, end of a game scenario, you're looking for a flag. And Juju's fumble at the end of the first half also was a lucky break for the Steelers in terms of time on the clock. If that would have been a situation where there was tons of time left on the clock, they didn't lose the ball, but Juju did lay it on the ground. That could have been more concerning. They went in the locker room and it just kind of meant nothing. But yeah, the referees were not, involved in this game, even though they missed calls. They're going to miss calls every week. They're not perfect. They're going to miss calls every week. There's holding on every single play. They're not going to call it every single play. And there's really more pass interference than ever before. I'm at least happy whenever we have a game that we don't see tons of reviewing of pass interference, because I think that's the worst thing the NFL has done, is allow a non-call of pass interference to be reviewed when it's just human element and you're reviewing something that wasn't there in the first place. So I'm glad we didn't see that too. So I'm not going to go much further on the referees from this game, but it's a tale of two halves. It was literally two different teams out there. So we just don't know until we get an entire full game put together, which is more reason why they play as much as they can against the Browns without getting hurt, and more reason why we still don't really know how good or bad this team can be in the postseason, because we've just seen Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in two polar opposite teams throughout recent weeks. But at least they're able to celebrate the division title. At least they're able to celebrate individual accomplishments and history of the defense. At least they're able to now have some happiness and maybe have some fire off of them from critics for a week or so. That has not been the case even while winning for months. So to back into a division title would have been awful. And winning this game with a comeback victory could be the key moment that turns this season back around. Again, we don't know until we see it.
Either way, a huge relief for the Steelers here this afternoon, this Sunday afternoon. They'll play again at 1 p.m. next Sunday afternoon. Who knows who's on the field for that one and for how long, but they'll have one more chance to tune it up before the playoffs. 12 wins on the board for the Steelers. After missing the playoffs in back-to-back years, they are back on top of the AFC North officially after a couple of missed opportunities. They get it done in comeback fashion. 17 points down in the second half for the first time under Mike Tomlin. That did not portend a loss for your black and gold. Next week, we'll have another Pittsburgh Postgame Steelers style, myself and Mike Asti, and then we'll get ready for the playoffs. Until that time, keep it locked right here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, our YouTube channel. Sign up for notifications, get the alerts. That way you won't miss a broadcast, or you won't miss our uploads of practice videos, of Zoom call interviews throughout the week. It's all right there on YouTube. Pittsburgh Sports Live, and SteelersNow.com is the site where you can find everything, including these post-game shows related to the Steelers that you need to know. Alan Saunders, Nick Faribaugh, and of course, our very own Mike Asti running the show over there and keeping things updated. For Mike, for you, thank you for watching. I'm Matt Gajtka saying good afternoon. We'll talk to you next time on Pittsburgh Postgame.